Megan. Y'all can have a seat. And good morning. If you are new, my name is Sharon. I am one of the pastors here at Bright City. And this morning I wanted to share a piece of my history, mine and Ike's history, that many of you may not know, which is that when we were working on our PhDs at the same time, this was a little over 10 years ago, we were living in the Chicago area at the time, both full-time students. And while we were both working on our doctorates, we lived in a $1 million home on a lake. This house was beautiful. We had this big open kitchen that looked out on the water. And because we were in the Chicago area during the winter, that lake froze over. And so it was just covered in a blanket of snow. And so it was stunning just all year round. And then the house itself was also very large. And because of that, we were able to do a lot of hosting. We hosted our small group there. But more significantly to us, this is where we were living when our first son Isaac was born. And so in the weeks leading up to his birth, both my parents and my mother-in-law essentially moved in with us for about a month. And the house was large enough that everyone could have their own bedroom and their own bathroom. Now, the houses around us were just like this as well. It was an incredibly nice neighborhood. And so I'll never forget going on walks with Ike and taking in these beautiful mansions and just laughing to ourselves that this was absolutely the nicest house in the nicest neighborhood that we would ever live in. And so I'm sure a lot of you are wondering right now, well, how did you afford this, considering you were both full-time students? And the answer is we did not. We lived there for free. We were there taking care of the house for the owners. This was an amazing provision for us at a time when we did not have much money, but we'd gotten connected with this family that had lots of houses around the country, and they spent most of their time at their home in Mexico, like you do, and they almost never came to this home in Chicago. We never saw them. And so it felt like, because we're the only ones there ever, it felt like this house was ours, like it was our home. And so I'll never forget how disorienting it was when the owner decided to sell the house. And for the first time in our years of living there, he returned. And it felt disorienting because up until that point, this home, in many ways, it felt like it was our family's home. But when the owner returned, that was the first time really where it was painfully clear that it was not. Now, the reason I wanted to start with this story is I wanted to do kind of a thought experiment. Imagine for a moment that this owner returned and we objected. He said he wanted to sell the house and we complained. If we had said, actually, this feels like our house now. Imagine what he would have said. Or imagine that the owner had returned and discovered that we had made a lot of changes to the house without his permission, changes that he did not want. It wouldn't have mattered that we had lived there for years. It didn't matter that it felt like it was our house. That didn't change the fact that it was not. We were not the owners. We were only the caretakers. Well, as we continue our series on generosity, we are 3 weeks in now to our deep dive of the spiritual discipline of generosity, a practice that cultivates our faith and makes us more like Jesus. The reason I wanted to start with this story is that it captures one of the radical claims of the Christian faith, which is that nothing we have actually belongs to us. Nothing. Not your money, your possessions, your time, your opportunities, your privileges, your freedom. All of this was given to us by God, not to keep for ourselves, but to steward for Him. That is a truth that we actually trace all the way back to the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, when God creates Adam and Eve, and then he gives them this home in the garden, but this garden does not belong to them. Instead, they are tasked with managing it. The word used there is to exercise dominion over it, but it does not belong to them. And this would become the blueprint for every human that would follow. It would define our relationship to the world around us. We are, from first to last, managers, not owners. Of course, this is incredibly easy to forget, especially as time goes by. In the same way that the longer we lived in that house, the longer the owner was away, the easier it was to think of it as ours. And the same is true of our lives. As we wait for Jesus to return and to finish what he started, it's easy to think of this world, it's easy to think of our lives as belonging to us. And so as we continue our study of generosity, this morning we are going to look at an important aspect of generosity, which is stewardship. We are generous not simply because God has been generous to us, but because what has been given to us is still not ours. It has been given to us to manage. Too often we think about this concept of tithing. It leads us to think that, 10% of what I have belongs to God, but 90%, the rest of it, belongs to me. But again, to be a follower of Jesus is to understand, no, 100% belongs to God. It is all his. We are simply the managers. And so this morning, I want to look at a parable that Jesus tells, which really drives this home. Not only does it remind us that we are managers, not owners, but it also tells us how to be a good steward. And that is the parable of the 10 minas. Now, I know that this parable is your favorite parable. This is the parable that you know by heart, right? This is the parable that you recite to your kids like every single week. You're very, very familiar with the parable of the 10 minas. In reality, most people do not know this parable. And there's a number of reasons why. One is, how do you pronounce that word? I don't know if you noticed, but Megan said Mina. I'm saying Mina. There's a division in the church over how to pronounce that word. In the Greek, it's pronounced Mina. And so that's already an obstacle, but it is also a very long passage. And so somebody get Megan a Gatorade, because that was a long time to stand in front of the church and read. And so there's a lot of reasons why we are not familiar with this parable. But this parable is very similar to another parable that many of you are probably familiar with, and that is the parable of the talents. So the parable of the talents is in Matthew 25. The parable of the minas is in Luke 19. And so if you are not familiar with either one, I wanted to do kind of a flyover of what these two parables, which are very, very similar. They're really only different by detail. But just a brief flyover of what is happening in these two stories. So first, in terms of how they are similar, in both of these parables, and there should be a slide that kind of delineates all of this. So first of all, in both of these parables, they feature a wealthy man who leaves. And while he is away, he entrusts his wealth to his servants to manage for him. Another thing that they have in common is that the first two servants that he entrusts with his wealth, they increase what is entrusted to them. And then in both parables, we see the third servant, however, he does nothing. He doesn't lose what has been entrusted to him. He doesn't waste it, but he doesn't increase it either. Then another feature they have in common is that the man rewards the first two servants with more responsibility, but then the man punishes the third servant and then takes that money that he entrusted to him and gives it to the first, because he's the one who increased his investment the most. And then the man punishes the third servant after he does that. But one thing that they both have in common, that I want to land on here that is especially important to understanding both of these parables is that even though one appears in Luke, one appears in Matthew, both of these parables, they are told at the end of Jesus's life. Both of these parables, Jesus tells them right before he leaves and goes to Jerusalem for what is called the triumphal entry. This is at the end of Jesus' life. This is what kicks off Holy Week. This is what we remember as Palm Sunday. And so he tells this right at the end of his life. And the reason why this matters is that it tells us that Jesus isn't telling these parables as generic lessons on money management. He is telling them because he is about to leave. And so these parables serve as instructions on how to handle his affairs while he is gone. So all of which is to say the overall message of the parable of the talents, the parable of the minas is the same. We are the servants in this story. What we have is not ours to keep, but simply to manage. And that ultimately we will give an account for what we did. So that is what they have in common. Briefly, I want to look at how these two parables differ. It's a very, very minor difference, but in the event that you ever find yourself in a situation where someone gives you a pop quiz and is like, quick, what's the difference between the parable of the talents, parable of the minas? You're going to leave here equipped this morning for that moment. So a few key differences. One is just the unit of money that we're talking about here. The first in the parable of the talents, a talent was the equivalent of modern day $1 to $3 million. It depends on if we're talking about a talent of silver or a talent of gold. But we're talking about a lot of money here. A mina was a lot less. It was 3 months' wages, and so not nearly as much, but still like a good chunk of change. So the stakes are a little bit lower, I would say, in the parable of the minas. In the parable of the talents, a man just goes on a journey. We're told very vaguely that he just leaves. But in the parable of the minas, we're told a nobleman leaves to receive his authority as king. And I'm going to come back to this because this is actually important, and I'm going to explain why in just a moment. But another way that they're different is the parable of the talents. The man gives his servants different amounts. He gives one 5, he gives one 2, he gives one 1. Whereas in the parable of the minas, he gives everyone the exact same amount, which is 1. Then in the parable of the talents, the lazy servant, he buries his money in the ground, whereas in the parable of the minas, he hides his money in a handkerchief. And then finally, in the parable of the talents, the first two servants, they are rewarded with more responsibility. We're not told exactly what that is, but in the parable of the minas, they are rewarded with authority over towns. So it's a significant promotion that we see. So those are just some of the key differences. None of these are huge, but the reason why I wanted to look at the parable of the minas this morning is that it does something that the parable of the talents does not, which is that it alludes to a real life historical event. I don't know if you noticed, there were a few random details in this story that they kind of throw you off a little bit. You're like, what does this have to do with this story? Like what is meant by this? One of those is in verse 12, where it says, a nobleman traveled to a far country to receive for himself authority to be king and then to return. This is alluding to something that actually happened. And then later, this is the detail that maybe caught your attention because it's a little bit strange and comes into play later in the parable as well. Verse 14, it says, but his subjects hated him and sent a delegation after him saying, we don't want this man to rule over us. So both of these would throw you off if you didn't understand that Jesus is speaking to a specific group of people at a specific time, and this is alluding to a real life event that happened in this region years before. What happened is that in this region, Herod had been king. But you have to understand that the pecking order here is that even though he is king, he is still under Caesar, who is the emperor. So this is the pecking order here. And so what happens is King Herod, he's king over Judea. He writes in his will that after I die, I want one of my sons to become king in my place. And so ultimately he does die. And because ultimately the king is not in control, but Caesar is, the son, he now has to leave and go to Rome and meet with Caesar in order to receive his kingship. And so that is what Jesus is really alluding to here in verse 12. But in addition to that, another important detail of that specific scenario is that the people that would be ruled over, they did not like that son. They did not want him to be king. And so they sent a delegation to Rome also to plead with Caesar not to make him king. All of which is to say Jesus is describing something that actually happened, or he's alluding to it rather. Now, why does all of this matter? This matters because parables, they are analogies, and that means that you can never do a one-to-one. Like you have to be really careful not to press a parable too far. But at the same time, Jesus is clearly comparing himself here to that king. Jesus himself is about to go to Jerusalem to be received as king. And so the parallel here is very clear that he is leaving just like that king once did, but he will also come back. One day he will return. And granted, the people listening to this, they had no idea how long that gap would be. But what he's saying through this parable is that while I am away, I expect you to live as faithful stewards of what I have entrusted to you. So with all of that in mind, this parable teaches us 3 important lessons about how to be a good steward while Jesus is away. How to be a good steward of what God has entrusted to us. Starting with number 1, the first principle that we draw from this parable is that good stewardship starts small. Notice that the ruler does not start out by giving them towns to manage. He starts out by giving them very little to see what they do with it. And as they demonstrate their responsibility or their lack thereof, this will determine whether the king can entrust more responsibility to them. This actually reminded me of my first job after college. A lot of you guys know I went to Duke, and it is incredibly embarrassing to confess that because I was a Duke grad, I rolled up to my first job with my shiny new Duke University diploma, and I just expected them to recognize how exceptional I was, and to just be totally impressed by me and to instantly give me leadership and influence in the organization. But instead, my experience of that job was much like many of your first jobs, which is that I made a lot of copies, I licked a lot of envelopes, and I took a lot of phone calls. And I will never forget how upsetting this was to me. I thought, and again, this is so embarrassing. This is so embarrassing to admit. I thought my talent and my intellect was being wasted by them. In reality, what was happening was my boss was entrusting me with a little to see if she could entrust me with a lot. So whether you are starting at a new job, or maybe you don't make a lot of money, maybe you feel like you don't have much influence or power, our default in those situations very often is to make excuses. It's easy to feel like you don't have enough to make an impact. You don't have enough to be effective, to have influence. It's also easy to think that because I don't have much, I need to protect the little that I have. And this was the mistake of the third servant. But what this is not is a stewardship mindset. Because a stewardship mindset recognizes that no matter the size, whether we're talking about finances, opportunities, influence, no matter the size, what you have does not belong to you. But also, no matter the size, what you have is not about you. What you have, whatever has been given to you was given to you for a greater purpose than you. And so a stewardship mindset thinks, what is the best way to leverage this for the kingdom of God? Because there is no resource too small for that. And so thinking about finances with a stewardship mindset, what that means is even if you feel like you don't have a lot of financial margin, a stewardship mindset asks, but how am I budgeting well what I do have? Am I being a good manager of what I do have? Maybe you feel like you don't have a lot of margin in your schedule, but good stewardship asks, am I budgeting my time well? Or is it possible I don't have a lot of margin in my schedule because I'm not managing my time well? Maybe hours of my days are being siphoned off by being on Facebook or being on TikTok or being on Netflix or playing video games. It's not that any of those things are wrong or bad, but maybe they are lacking in proportion to what they should be and causing you to mismanage your days. Maybe you are at the bottom of the totem pole at work and you wish you had more influence, but good stewardship asks, am I stewarding the little responsibility that I have now? Am I on time? Am I dependable and responsible? Am I a hard worker? How am I demonstrating that I can be entrusted with more? Not simply by my bosses, but by God. Whatever is the thing that you see as a limitation in some way, I want to challenge you to instead think of that with a stewardship mindset. How are you stewarding your singleness? How are you stewarding your wisdom and life experience? Maybe you're an empty nester. How are you stewarding all that knowledge that you have gained? How are you pouring that back into young people? How are you stewarding something as small as your words? How are you stewarding them? Whatever it is that God has given you in this season, no matter the size, the question is not whether God wants you to manage it well, but how. Good stewardship starts small, and it determines whether God is going to entrust you with more. That is number one. The second principle that we glean from this parable is that good stewardship takes risks. This one is counterintuitive. Because good stewardship, what it does not mean is playing it safe. This was the mistake of that third servant. The servant who kept his mina safe in a handkerchief ultimately disobeyed the ruler's instructions because the instruction was not preserve this. The instruction was put this to work. And that's why the master was so unhappy when he returned. In contrast, the servants who made a profit, they did so by taking a risk. Because you cannot make a profit without the risk of losing a profit. That's what happens when you invest in something. There is no sure thing. I was reminded of this years ago when Ike and I were meeting with our advisory board, and we were talking about the church's finances, and we had saved up quite a bit of money because we wanted to be prepared for when and if a permanent building came along, that we would have the financial flexibility to move on that property. However, we weren't finding any options, and so the money was just sitting there in the bank. And I'll never forget, one of our advisors, he commented, he said, this is actually not good stewardship to have all this money just sitting there. We need to be putting some of it to work. And so because of that insight, we eventually decided to invest some of that money, not all of it, but some of it. We decided to invest it into building up our pastoral staff so that we could shepherd this community well, regardless of the physical space that we are in. Was this the safe option? No, it was not, but it was good stewardship. Another risk that we take here as leaders in our church, and this is a risk that many of you who have leadership positions in your own organizations or companies, this is available to you as well, is that we at Bright City, we give a lot of leadership opportunities to our younger staff. It's why we have, I don't know if you've noticed this, but we have quite a few young preachers. Now, when you give a young, untested person a shot, there is a risk of it not going well, of it going sideways. But the alternative is not stewarding the calling and gifts of our young leaders. Of course, none of these risks were taken hastily or without wise counsel or prayer, but too often, the fear of failure or fear of making the wrong decision keeps us playing too safe. While God doesn't want us to be reckless, this parable reminds us that sometimes God is far more pleased by strategic risks that are taken in faith than safe bets which are not. And so I want to speak to those of you specifically here this morning who have recently taken risks. Whether it was taking a new job, maybe it was moving across the country in order to cultivate your gifts or steward your calling. That is true of so many of you who are here. Maybe you took a chance on a young leader. Maybe you gave money sacrificially to an organization or ministry you believed in. Maybe you just leveraged the influence that you have in the workplace or in your neighborhood to share about your faith. And maybe it didn't go well. Maybe it didn't just go the way that you thought that it would. But if that is you, I want you to know you didn't fail. You didn't fail to be a good steward. If you prayed about it and sought wise counsel, God is far more pleased by your efforts to steward what he has given you in faith than safe decision making that is really only a guise for you remaining in control. So that's number 2. Good stewardship takes risks. And then finally, good stewardship represents the values of the owner. There's kind of 2 sub-truths that are wrapped up in this. One I've already mentioned, which is that in order to be a good steward, to represent the value of the owner, you have to recognize that you are not the owner. That what you have does not belong to you, that what you have is not for you. But there's another sub-truth underneath this idea that good stewardship represents the values of the owner, is that we cannot be good stewards if we misunderstand the character and values of the owner. This was the mistake of that third servant who fundamentally misunderstood the character of the ruler. Remember in verses 20 through 21, he says, "Here is your mina. I've kept it safe in a cloth because I was afraid of you, since you're a harsh man. You collect what you didn't deposit and reap what you didn't sow." What an audacious thing to say, when the ruler had generously shared his influence with this man. He invited this servant to have authority, to have dominion, just as God once did with Adam and Eve. But rather than recognize this gesture as a form of trust, as a form of generosity, as a calling up of sorts, the servant managed the money as if the ruler was stingy, judgmental, and harsh, which again reminds us that we cannot be good stewards if we misunderstand the character and the values of the owner. That said, the weird thing about this story, and I don't know if you noticed this when Megan was reading through it, but the owner seems to kind of validate this a little bit. Because he says, I know that you're harsh. I know that you are judgmental. And the owner responds kind of like, "Oh, I'll show you harsh." And so when you're reading that, you're kind of like, what do I make of this? Like, what does this mean? What is this telling us about God? All of which leads us to the plot twist of this entire parable. This parable ends very darkly with him punishing the servant, removing his influence, and then having his enemies killed in his presence. What does this mean? Well, remember, as I said, parables are only analogies. And so while Jesus is comparing himself to this king, he is also contrasting himself with this king. What Jesus will demonstrate immediately after he tells this story is that, yes, he is a king, but not like this one. He is a king who will not kill his enemies, but be killed for his enemies. That is the sort of king that he is. And for us to understand the character and values of the owner, that is what the owner is like. Which means we steward what God has given us with urgency, but not with fear. We steward what God has given us with freedom and joy, knowing that God is inviting us to participate with him in the rescue and redemption of the world. And so as we close this morning, what I want to do is I want to speak back to you the two responses that the owner spoke to his servants, because he had really two different types of servants. And here this morning, we have two different types of people as well. And so I want to speak both of those responses over you, and I'm going to ask that the Holy Spirit would help to clarify which one of these is for you. Because for some of you, you are being an excellent steward of what God has entrusted to you. I don't know if anyone has said that to you, but for some of you, that is absolutely true. It has been messy. It has been hard. You feel like you don't have much to show for it, but you have been faithful. You have sought him in prayer. Your heart's desire is to be obedient, to be a good steward. And so if that is you, I want you to know that God looks on you with delight. He looks on you with pleasure. He looks on you with pride. He looks at you and he says, well done, good and faithful servant. But for some of you, I want you to receive the loving kick in the tail that this parable was always meant to be. The life you have is not your own, but some of you are living as if it is. And so to you, I want to challenge you to accept that invitation to be called up, to quit playing it safe, to stop messing around, and to step into the call that God has placed on your life. If you're a follower of Jesus, God has placed a call on your life. And spoiler alert, it is not your job. You have a much higher call than that. Because remember, again, our king is not like this king. Our king uses his power to heal the sick, to free the captive, to deliver the oppressed, to restore the lost, to pursue the marginalized, to give hope to the hopeless, to bring peace to a violent world. And you can be a part of that, or you can bury your life in a handkerchief of comfort. And so my question for you this morning is, which one will you be? As always, I'm going to invite our prayer team forward to give you some time to reflect on this with God in prayer. And I do want to say, if you are in a season where you have felt like I've done my best to be a good steward, I feel like I don't have much to show for it, and you feel discouraged and you're wrestling with feelings of failure, please let us come alongside of you and hold that with you in prayer. Our prayer team would love to pray over and also just to speak truth over you, that you have done enough. God only asks us to bring him our need. You have done enough. But for some of you, I want to give you a few moments before we head into communion to reflect that this might be your moment where God is calling you up. It's time to get serious, to accept that call that he has placed on your life. Let's take some time in prayer now.